So once in a while I get asked just how close a blood relative is this J23 to the old CJ3B, and without actually having one on hand, it's a little bit hard to say. But luckily there are some drawings and plans from the old days that I can have a look at and try to get an idea from there. The other question that will come up is, so how does this thing stack up against some of its contemporary rivals? So for example, another working four-wheel drive vehicle from the late 80s. And when I think about that, really about the closest comparison I can come up with is the Land Rover Defender 90. It's a little bit bigger, but it's also a contemporary solid axle vehicle. Okay, it has the nice coil springs front and back, and it has disc brakes, but it's still got that same sort of typical all mechanical systems, no electronics to speak of, so it seems like a fairly good comparison. So I'm going to have a little delve into that sort of comparison today.
Without either one of those vehicles available for test, I got into a little digging on this, and since we're back in lockdown here, I have time off from camping and road trips. Direct field trial info on the CJ3B is pretty scarce, but I can pull apart the field trial done on the Mitsubishi J53, which was performed by Kawina Research for Michigan Tech back in 1967. I brought this up in my Type 73 history video, which is linked up above. As an engineer, I love objective test data and instinctively distrust marketing blurb. In 1961, Mitsubishi had launched versions of their CJ3B clones with the KE31 diesel engine that they had developed themselves. I think they were so impressed with its torque and economy, they probably thought they could get Uncle Sam to buy a few and complete the circle. Maybe Uncle Sam thought they could test the offered vehicle, and if it showed promise, ask Kaiser Willys to make something similar. Either way, Michigan Tech duly tested the vehicle against a standard issue M606 and produced a report upon it. That largely states that the diesel could do everything that the Willys unit could, except start in very low temperatures, and gave remarkable fuel economy. It was a little slower to accelerate on the highway and was rougher and noisier than the Hurricane-powered model, but no big fuss was made of that, and Uncle Sam isn't really in the business of luxury transportation anyway. Going over this report again gave me a few new insights. Despite my stated dislike of marketing talk, I do like old catalogs, and the old Mitsubishi ones are really gorgeous. Here's one from I think 1982, which gives some quite specific claims on the performance of the J53 model available then, which was a successor model to the J3. This is a little unusual for them and reminded me of the sort of materials that Land Rover used to put out back in those days. You can't sell vehicles to the military or even serious expedition teams with just vague claims or talk of conquering any terrain. They want hard numbers. So you see some fairly remarkable claims being made here in regard to side slope performance, and I was also struck by the difference in climb angle or gradability versus the figures in the manuals that I have from Mitsubishi. First, I wanted to have a quick comparison of a few numbers versus the CJ3B. I see that they are claiming 47 degrees for both approach and departure angles, which is impressive. A look at the CJ3B drawings shows roughly the same approach numbers, 46 versus 47 degrees, but the CJ3B drawing only shows 35 degrees for departure. So, looking at the J53 drawings from the manual, you can see easily that the approach of 47 degrees is there, but the departure figure is a full 10 degrees short of what's claimed in the catalogue. I'm also aware that the tub on the J53 is longer in the back than the CJ, so it's likely not 37 degrees either. By comparison, a Defender 90 from this era also claimed an approach angle of 47 degrees, but had an impressive departure angle of 48 degrees. Now, knowing that my J23 has a wheelbase that's a full 200 millimeters longer than the CJ3B or J53, and an even longer tub, I wondered about how much longer its tail is, and sure enough, it's noticeable. Nowhere near the 47 degree angle is possible for departure, not even the 37 degrees the CJ3B claims either. Adjusting the ramp angle here came up with a very unimpressive 26 degrees. Okay, not to be discouraged, I had a look around at some other numbers. The CJ3B drawing gives a breakover angle of 33 degrees. The J53 drawing doesn't show that, but if you draw it in, it almost matches that at 31 degrees. Going over to Land Rover, they claim 149 degrees because they prefer to be obtuse, and that converts to the same 31 degrees if you just look at it the other way. My J23 drawing shows the effect of the longer wheelbase coming in at 29 degrees. So this is where a few numbers start to pop out at me. The J53 brochure again claims 43 degrees roll angle. That is, the Jeep could drive sideways across a 43 degree slope without rolling over. Now, Land Rover claimed a similarly impressive 40 degrees. But then I remember something from the Army-sponsored JC3 test, and in that text it says, "In the side slope stability determination, the limiting condition was not imposed by the angularity of the slope per se, but rather by the limited shear strength of the soil conditions specified in the test procedure. On packed dirt, the maximum side slope negotiated approached 35 degrees, and even in this success was marginal. On sand, the maximum slope was limited to less than 25 degrees. Both of these figures are considerably less than the maximum safe tilting angle, 44 degrees, specified by the manufacturer." Of course, I don't have access to the specifications that were offered to the Japanese military, but the Mitsubishi manual for the J53 and J23 does have some figures, so let's take a look at that. So here we see the slope angle is claimed at 43 degrees, both left and right, for both the J53 and J23. I wondered, did they get better performance out of the more modern radial tires fitted to the J53? And then I remembered the J23 came with the standard non-directional tires that weren't much different to what was in use in 1967. The track width on the J53 is just slightly wider because of the tires. Maybe the center of gravity is also the same. Ground clearance is the same. But the center of gravity data isn't available for the J53, only the J23. It sort of seems unlikely, though, that the center of gravity is vastly different. Now I really wonder about the slope angle claims for the Defender. Moving on, going back to the J53 catalog, it offers just 35 degrees of slope climb versus the Defender's 45 degrees. But wait, the J53 and J23 manual has a tractive force curve chart. That seems to offer more than that. Now, these charts aren't in great resolution and are a little confusing if you're not used to reading them, but I'll just walk you through the steps here. Now, here's the motive force that's available in high fourth gear. They are very thorough in working this out, and they consider the vehicle mass, the overall gear ratio, the tire diameter, and even the gear train efficiency along the way. Here you can see that the line I've highlighted crossed the 5% grade line quite early and crosses the 3% line at close to maximum RPM. That means that the Jeep will not quite be able to pull fourth gear high ratio all the way to redline up at 3% grade, though on flat ground it would. Now we can look at the other end of the scale and see what grade it can climb in low range. Here you see the motive force curve for second gear low. If we look over to the right, we can see that the curve was above the 50% line for most of its range, and even hits 55% at peak torque. So we know that we can comfortably climb a 50% grade in too low, which is a 22.5 degree slope. But what about the granny gear, you ask? Well, here you can see the 80, 90, 100 degree grade lines marked out. And here you can see how far the motive curve for one low actually is. Extrapolating, I'd say that it's up in the sort of range of 120% grade. So my guess here is that in the manual, Mitsubishi are publishing what the drivetrain is capable of pulling, and in the J53 brochure there is some honesty about what the tires and suspension geometry can manage. Perhaps what the JC3 tests at Michigan Tech show is the limits of traction more than that of tractive power. Is Land Rover then making claims for their powertrain and ignoring what their tires are capable of? Probably. Moving on, there are a few numbers which are very well matched. All three vehicles have about 200 millimeters of ground clearance, with the Jeeps just edging the Defender out. Land Rover are a bit cheeky, calling the Defender a 90 when the wheelbase is actually almost 93 inches or 2,360 millimeters. That's almost as long as a YJ Wrangler. The CJ3B and J53 are tiny by comparison at just 80 inches wheelbase. One surprise is that the track on the CJ3B is almost 2 inches less than on the Mitsubishi models at 1,230 millimeters versus 1,300. The Landy is the widest by far at 1,491 millimeters. Is that wider stance enough to justify the side slope claims? Fording depth for all vehicles is about 500 millimeters. Turning circle for the Defender and J23 are very close, and more surprisingly the CJ3B loses out to the J53. Usually a narrower track means a bigger turning radius, but in this case the wider J53 easily outturns the original. Perhaps it's the use of the CV jointed front axle versus the old universal joint one, I'm not sure. Comparing weights is a little tricky since not all manufacturers define it in the same way. In some they leave the fuel tanks empty, but the sump's full of oil, things like that. The shipping weight of the CJ3B was claimed to be a mere 950 kilograms. The Defender is supposed to weigh 1,630 kilograms dry, which is nearly 70% more. The J23 comes in around the middle at 1,360 kilos. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, it's clear that there are some big differences in how some numbers are probably taken with a pinch of salt, especially the slope performance. I'm now aware that there's probably a lot of wiggle room between a hard dry surface and a muddy or sandy slope, and it's a good reminder to use your judgment before committing to a line. Don't put too much faith in an inclinometer, eh? I'm also acutely aware now of how long and how low my butt is compared to my contemporaries, and I'll be more mindful to leave the room before the door actually hits me on the way out.